Good morning. Yes. There's great energy in this room. As Executive Director of the Literacy Center, I want to welcome you to the 6th Annual Literacy Summit. As many of you know, I also serve as President of the Grand Rapids Public Schools Board of Education. Leading a literacy organization and the Board of Ed, I am acutely aware of the crisis in our community. We are squandering our most precious asset, our children. Michigan is ranking at the bottom of the nation for literacy rates in America. We are in last place for African American boys. And it's not just that we haven't kept pace with other states. Literacy rates have actually declined over the last decade. This is indeed a crisis. By not providing for the conditions under which children will reach their fullest potential, we are not only doing them a disservice, we are doing ourselves a disservice. We are doing ourselves and the future of our entire community. But each of you know this. All of you know this. This is why you are here this morning. This is why each of you, in some way, are dedicating your time, your money, your effort, and your conscience to changing these conditions. You understand that it is not only necessary, it's possible. That we do have the solutions to change things. Today we are convening to share our hard-won wisdoms, to learn from each other, and to strategize on the changes we make, and to champion and support what we know what works. I have the deepest respect for those doing the work, the day-to-day frontline work, the educators. They hold much of the wisdom, and we need to do better to listen to them. I'm pleased that today we will hear from 3 of Michigan's Teachers of the Year, and it is my pleasure to introduce this year's educator recognized for his excellence in the profession, our own West Michigan's Luke Wilcox. Mr. Wilcox is a math teacher from East Kentwood High School, recognized not only as Michigan's Teacher of the Year, but also with a Presidential Award for Excellence in Mathematics and Science Teaching. Luke is dedicated not only to his students, but to supporting teachers in their professional growth. And to this end, he created Rising Teacher Leaders Group, an intense mentorship and support program for new teachers in his school. We are all in this together. Please help me in welcoming a teacher, a professional leader who truly understands that this is our shared opportunity and our shared responsibility. Thank you, Luke.
Well, good morning. Good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to stand before you to talk this morning. And I realize that this is a bit unusual because you are at a literacy conference with a specific focus of 3rd grade reading. And now here I stand before you as a high school math teacher. But I promise you that I have some very close connections to the work that you are currently doing, and that I have a very vested interest in the success of all of your work. And so I'd like to try and share with you 3 of my own personal close connections with your work. So number 1, and my most proud are my own children. So I have a 4th grader. Her name is Reese. She's at North Oakview Elementary. You got any people from Northview in here? Yeah, all right. My daughter Reese devours books. She loves reading. She had been through the entire Harry Potter series by the end of 3rd grade and continues to just eat up books. My son Trey is a 1st grader at North Oakview Elementary, and he is now very proudly reading his own chapter books. And we just finished I think the 12th one of the Notebook of Doom last night. Needless to say, my children love reading. They love reading. And I know that this does not happen just by chance. It is the concerted effort of a lot of individuals that made that happen. Obviously, their teachers that they've had at school, the librarian, the reading specialist, the principal, the curriculum directors. It is a team of individuals that has created this desire for reading amongst my own children. And I'm so very grateful for that. Now, my second connection is my wife. She just happens to be an elementary school teacher at North Oakview Elementary, 3rd grade, by the way. And so you talk about all of this work for 3rd grade. I see it. I see her in the middle of it. I see her working on it at 9 o'clock at night, getting ready for the next day. And so, I went to her and I said, what is the biggest benefit that you've seen so far because of this 3rd grade bill? And she thought pretty hard about this, and she said, and this surprised me, she said this has really created an opportunity for the schools to talk with people from the homes, to talk to the parents, to open up communication about the importance of reading at an early level. And she said that this opportunity to communicate with parents has created more buy-in from her parents, and she feels more supported from her parents as far as developing readers than she's ever felt in her entire career. And my third connection is to my own classroom. Okay, I'm a high school math teacher. But tell me, how often have you heard a math student say, "I hate story problems"? Maybe you said that when you were in school as well. Oftentimes what they're really saying is, "I struggle with reading and my comprehension. And if I were better at reading and comprehension, maybe I wouldn't hate story problems like that." And so I argue that if we make better 3rd grade readers, you're going to make better high school math students. And I need that. And it's not just math. I mean, it's all subject areas. Early literacy is the key to unlocking the potential in the learning of students in all subject areas in all grade levels. And that's why I think that this work is so important. So what can we do? Well, I think the biggest thing that I can say that we can do is to continue to make early literacy a priority. And obviously the state has done that in a very bold way. But we right here in this room are the ones that actually have to do the work. And obviously that's why you guys are here, because you see it as a priority. But how can we help others to see this as a priority as well? And so I'd just like to say thank you, number one, for my own children and their love of reading, for my wife and the work that you're doing to help support what she's doing in her classroom, but also for helping my own high school math students in my classroom. So thank you for being here. So I'd like to hand it over to Mike Nassar, who is the director of the Community Literacy Initiative.
Good morning. I'm Mike Nassar, Director of the Community Literacy Initiative at the Literacy Center of West Michigan, and I'm just so excited to see so many friends and colleagues and literacy supporters here today, and I know we even have some Grand Valley students sitting in the back, so welcome. Thanks for coming today. I want to take a moment to thank my fellow staff at the Literacy Center and the Literacy Board for their support of CLI. I also want to thank the CLI Advisory Council and the Summit Planning Committee. This event would not be possible without their commitment and contributions. Like so many of you here today, I've had the privilege of a career spent in education. Over the past 30 years, I've been fortunate to be a teacher, a principal, and also support new building administrators. In addition to my current role at CLI, I also do student teachers at Grand Valley, as I indicated, so I have the opportunity to see folks starting out in our profession. Back in 2011, while I was principal at Harrison Park School, right here in Grand Rapids Public Schools, the Grand Rapids Community Foundation offered our school and GRPS a great opportunity. How would you like to be able to offer college scholarships for all of your students, starting with the class of 2020? Needless to say, the start of the Challenge Scholars was a very exciting time at Harrison Park School. We decorated our halls with university banners and pictures of our college-bound students. We hired a math and literacy coach to work with our teachers. We added a college pathway coordinator. College presidents like GVSU's own Thomas Haas met with our students and talked with them about the importance of education. 90% of our students said they were working harder in school to get ready for college and a career. But with this opportunity came the daunting weight of the responsibility on our staff and community. Could we make sure that our students would be academically ready and able to take advantage of the scholarship? Would they be prepared to enter high school and college? I'm proud to say that our staff rallied around the urgency of that challenge then. It motivated us to work harder, to work smarter, and with an invigorated sense of purpose. These key questions continue to face us today. How can we best prepare the students in our care? How can we empower them with the skills and dispositions for a vibrant and productive future? It's something of an irony to me that the same year our first class of Challenge Scholars finish high school and enter college, 2020, is also the first year that third graders in the state of Michigan may be retained based on their end-of-year assessment results. Obviously, there's still much work to be done. We are here today, as Wendy indicated, because we believe that all children in our community deserve the opportunity for a bright and successful future. And reading on grade level is the foundation of that success. It is truly our shared opportunity, our shared responsibility to make this happen for all kids in West Michigan. All right, it's my pleasure at this time to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Over a year ago, as I began planning the work of today's summit, I reviewed dozens of prospective speakers. This morning, Claudio asked me how I came upon his name. We were trying to find just the right person to frame our event. And when I came across his name, I was immediately drawn to his distinctive voice and his powerful ability to tell a story. If, like me, you are a regular listener of NPR, you are familiar with his reporting on a wide variety of educational issues facing our nation. His focus is on the 3 Ps of education reform: politics, policy, and pedagogy. After serving as an elementary and middle school teacher, he began a decorated career as a journalist, producer, and executive director. He has received numerous awards and recognition for his work. His biography in our program includes a detailed description of the many accolades he's garnered in his career. And wisely, somebody told me not to read all of those, so I'm not going to read all those to you today. For the past 29 years, he has been a distinctive and valued presence at NPR. Currently, his reports air in NPR's award-winning news magazines Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and Weekend Edition. We're so pleased that he's here today to talk with us about the critical issue of grade level reading. Please give a warm West Michigan welcome to Mr. Claudio Sanchez.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for this invitation. I've always seen these invitations as a chance to escape from planet Washington. And I mean that. It's a very different place, living in a very different universe. And I thank Luke. Luke, thank you for framing this discussion that we're going to have. And by the way, you're all going to get a chance to ask questions. I don't want to lecture. I don't want to go on and on and on without hearing from you and what your main concerns are. So I'm assuming there will be a chance for, or a microphone somewhere for you to ask questions. And I thank Luke, since we're talking about our kids, because he's absolutely right, and you all know this, that it's not just schools, it's life outside schools that often dictates kids' abilities to not just read, but to feel like they're successful. And reading is often a wonderful indicator of the confidence that kids begin school with, and when they realize that their reading skills are going to take them very far. And it happens early. In my case, my daughter, I remember I would drive her to school when she was in first, second grade, and she too was one of these kids who was loved reading to this day. And I remember trying to listen to a story that I was worried about because I didn't know if it had been edited, or I should say produced. It was a complicated story. I was concerned about how Morning Edition had mixed it, and my daughter was reading in the back, and I turned up the radio, and it just occurred to me, I said, Bianca, do you know what your dad does for a living? And she didn't even look up. She just said, Dad, you blah, 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 blah. And she, it's very humbling. It was a really good job description. My daughter's now in Japan teaching English as a second language. She's been there a couple of years. And she hasn't decided whether she wants to come back and teach here. Her actual major was in environmental sciences. But she has always told me, Dad, I think I have the DNA of an educator. And I guess we all do. I don't care what field you're in. We're all educators. And it gets back to what Luke said about our role, how we see our role, not just with our kids, but with our extended family, our extended community. Let me start off with I think the good news. For all its flaws, the American education system is a system, as the columnist Robert Samuelson has put it, it's a system of second, third, fourth, fifth chances. The genius of America is that it is a place where, including in the education system, it's a place where anybody can reinvent themselves. You know, that kid who didn't do well in Luke's high school math class, that kid who dropped out, who never even considered college was realistic, that kid can come back as a young adult and even as an older adult. And the community college system in this country, which is unlike any other system in the world, is a place where people can reinvent themselves. I've met so many people who, despite all the things that they've been through in their early lives, can come back and say, I'm going to give this a second shot. And often, these are people who didn't read very well. These are people who saw themselves and their future is limited because of their poor reading skills. And let me tell you the story of one such person who I met many years ago. Her name was Vivian. Vivian grew up poor, dropped out of high school, ended up in a bad marriage that tragically turned violent, abusive. She woke up in a hospital bed one day and realized that her life was in jeopardy. Her young daughter's life was in jeopardy. This was not the life that Vivian wanted, and she had to find a way out. Not long after leaving the hospital, she walked into a college campus in Seattle, hoping against hope that it would change her life. But she could barely read. The government grants and loans weren't all that much, but in Vivian's case, the money was enough to live on and to go to school, support her daughter. But she couldn't read. And so she wondered whether college was a good decision or a waste of time. But in pursuing more education, Vivian began to change. Her reading skills improved thanks to fellow students, mentors, tutors, who said, we're not going to let you fail. And to her amazement, her daughter started talking about the day she would start college. Vivian and her little girl began spending time with other students and on and off campus. The worlds widened beyond the public housing project where they lived, and where so many dreams were crushed by the sheer weight of the poverty and the fatalism that envelops such places. Vivian began to change because finally she began to see a way out for her and for her daughter. It was a remarkable feeling. The realization that she had the power to break the cycle for good, the cycle of failure, dependency, and despondency. Learning to read, she told me, saved my life. People who think that reading, knowing how to read well, is not a matter of life and death are wrong. For many, it is. Vivian went on to earn her doctorate and to write extensively about single moms, domestic violence, and her daughter, she made it to college as well. Now, I lost track of both of them, but I've never forgotten her story, a story about possible lives and about hope. What is the story of America, if not a story about hope? And yet, how hopeful can we be when so many of our children and fellow citizens cannot read? So many Vivians out there who we'll never hear about. I don't know if you remember, many years back, there was a movie that came out. The movie was called Won't Back Down. Anybody remember seeing it? Anyway, it was Hollywood's story of a young mother's fight to shut down a struggling public school and turn it into a charter school. And at one point, the protagonist, this mother, screams, "I can't wait for 10,000 stories or studies about how being poor affects education, but all I can tell you is that being poor sucks, and my kid can't read." It's hard to think of a more satisfying solution to poverty, ladies and gentlemen, than a good education, because it's based on the ennobling view and the idea that poor families and their children can overcome poverty. If only they had a good education, a good public school to go to. Certainly a school where kids are learning how to read. That fundamental task that schools have, but that too many miss. But is it true, though? Is it true? Does the research really show us, those 10,000 studies, support the idea of how much school matters in the lives of impoverished children? Or, as many believe, are the inequalities imposed on children by their home, neighborhood, peer group, passed along to become inequalities at school and beyond? In other words, can good teachers who know how to teach children how to read, a rigorous curriculum, and a safe school with the necessary resources fully and truly compensate for the things that so many children lack in this country? Healthcare, inadequate housing, family dysfunction, addiction, trauma, for God's sake. Trauma studies that are coming up these days that show that the toll that it takes on children very early on, sometimes just as they begin school, to take on this incredibly complicated task of learning how to read. Think about the trauma that has in adults, let alone children. You know, the research these days, I was mentioning earlier to some folks, the research these days that we have about reading and about the consequences of not teaching kids how to read is eye-opening. I got into, the reporting of education way back when research was essentially stuff that was gathering dust in some warehouse somewhere. Diane Ravitch, who I don't know if you know, before her transformation, was she was an assistant secretary for research at the U.S. Department of Education in the Bush administration. And she used to go up to the Capitol Hill and talk till she was blue in the face about the importance of research that she and others had commissioned. Much of it about reading. How do we teach reading? Why are we in the middle of these reading wars? And I remember that research, which is now barely beginning to see the light of day, essentially the question for many lawmakers boiled down to, okay, so you found something really eye-opening. Can you get it into my district? Because that's the only way I'll fund it. As far as I'm concerned, that's what's wrong with not just the politics of education, but with politics in general. This self-interest rather than our collective interest. If it doesn't benefit my constituency, the people who vote for me, you're wasting your time. It's people who, for whatever reason, cannot see the collective interest in having all American children read, at least in this case. Fred Morrison, has anybody heard of Fred Morrison at the University of Michigan? Fred Morrison did a really interesting study some years back. It's in a book that I recommend to all if you haven't heard of it or read it. It's called The Language at the Speed of Sight by Marc Seidenberg. He's a cognitive neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin. Marc Seidenberg. And the book is Language at the Speed of Sight. It's a phenomenal book that gets into the pedagogy, politics, and into the trenches of schools, good and bad. But he cites Fred Morrison's research because, it's one of these studies that showed basically that when people question whether reading and the role of schools is important, it is one of the few studies that has been very explicit about why school matters versus age, even versus socioeconomic factors. School matters because, as Morrison puts it, reading has two components: print knowledge and comprehension. The beginning reader gets the comprehension part for free. But basic skills require instruction and practice. Parents can't take on that responsibility entirely. They need schools. And I'm not talking here about, what the reading wars were all about, phonics versus whole language, quality books versus rote, repetition, memorization, symbols, sounds. I don't want to get into that debate. All I know is that, as Seidenberg puts it, this nation for a long time missed the chance to create a balanced approach to reading, and we are suffering the consequences of that. And it happened for all the wrong reasons. It was ideological. It was cultural. It was political. And here we are in 2018, still struggling with such a basic issue. Can our children read? And when we now compare it to our place in the world, when we see the data out of the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development, OECD, the Paris-based group, that sometimes oversees things like PISA and TIMSS and all these studies and surveys. There was an interesting thing that OECD kind of concluded not that long ago. It concluded that the socioeconomic disadvantages lead more directly to poor educational performance in the U.S. than is the case anywhere else in the world. And we're talking about other countries that have poverty, that have poor kids. But here's what they found, and I'm quoting. Our schools in this country, in other words, are not doing nearly as much as they could to close the achievement gap, meaning the reading gap. As school children age in America, in American schools, they make less progress each year than children in the best performing countries, according to the OECD. By contrast, high performing countries not only dramatically boost student achievement, they do so while achieving or closing the achievement gap between rich and poor. Now, Finland is often given as an example. And if any of you have read about Finland, I've spoken to the Ministry of Education there, who are visiting Washington. And I asked them, what is the secret of Finland? In Finland, I don't know if you know, kids don't even have to start reading until second grade. What? That would be scandalous. But you know what the issue is? Their solution has been an extraordinary investment in early childhood education. It's universal. It's free. It's high quality. The people hired for this. Our series out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, some couple of years back, that we're continuing to follow. Tulsa has probably, in my view, the best model for universal preschool. It's not, I hate the cliche, but it's not rocket science. It's not a magic wand. It's hard work. And it's an effort that takes an entire community. If you talk to business people in Tulsa, and they say, what's the secret to the success of kids in Tulsa? Preschool. God, don't you know that? What's the matter with you? It doesn't take that much to understand that the minute you get these kids off on the right foot with pre-literacy, with good reading teachers, as soon as they hit first grade, pre-K, kindergarten, where kids know their colors, they know their letters, they know how to count. The minute you get these kids launched with some degree of confidence, you can predict, as the Tulsa study, which is longitudinal, run out of the University or Georgetown University, Deborah Phillips there, who's done an extraordinary job following this. We talk to kids, 15 and 16-year-olds, who are products of this program. And you talk to their parents, non-English speaking parents in most cases. And you ask them, how come your kid is doing so well in high school? Well, we have to go back 15 years. Well, not 15 years, maybe 12 years, and see what happened when this kid was 3 and 4. And it's so clear. It is so clear. Now, the Center for National Center for Education Statistics, where I often have to go to for data to look, because, you know, there is so much data out there that is biased. There's an agenda often behind it. And the best we can do is go to the National Center for Education Statistics to look at, well, what are the government figures showing us as a nation, not so much state by state. It shows that in schools with less than 25% poverty rates, American children scored higher in reading. Get this. They scored higher in reading than any other group of children in the world. Think about that. Schools with 25% or less poverty. Children read as well as any other child in the world. Now, the reason I think that's important is because we have now to talk, as I wind this down. How much time do I have? Let's talk about the social capital of schools, as I was asked to do. Look at this big picture that we're all facing with this issue of reading in third grade. Here's the social capital in schools. We all know of, or most of us know of, James Samuel Coleman. He's the influential University of Chicago sociologist and researcher, and probably one of the earliest users of the term social capital. That was back in the mid-1960s. He produced the landmark Coleman Report, which helped transform educational theory and reshape national education policy, and also influenced the public debate at the time and since then over the role of schooling and determining equality. Going back to that point about how poverty plays a role in kids' ability to read and in the quality of their schools in general. So, Coleman argued that what schools offer has a limited impact on students' achievement. In the case of low-income children, Coleman found that the quality of facilities, curriculum, teachers account for no more than a third of the variation in their academic performance. So, he concluded, schools in America can't really close the gap between rich and poor in reading or anything else. Now, he said this right in the middle of when the Johnson administration had launched this nation's historic Great Society campaign, which, among other things, set out to prove that schooling could alleviate poverty. Think about the beginning of the Head Start program. I believe it was piloted in Wheeling, West Virginia. I've been there. That place hasn't really changed that much. But Wheeling, West Virginia was the one place where people thought we can get this population of poor Appalachian families to buy into this notion that they will get some help because they clearly are at a disadvantage, certainly economically. And Head Start said, we're going to begin these kids and get them off on that right foot. So you fast forward 50, 60 years, and you realize that, yeah, it helped transform that community. But for every step we've taken forward, we've lost one. Because if you go to Wheeling, West Virginia today and look at those Head Start eligible children, the community may not be as poor as it used to be in the mid-60s, but there's a lot of poverty in Wheeling, West Virginia. And I would dare say throughout this country in communities like that, where the challenge of getting pre-literacy skills into these programs is just as huge as it is today, as it was back then. So here we have Mr. Coleman essentially challenging the whole premise of whether or not schools could matter. That's what I mean by this dueling data that's out there, with respected researchers like that and others who take a totally different view and come to totally different conclusions about why school does matter. What are we to believe? If I go down the street today and ask, in fact, I did this morning, I asked some of the people at the hotel, do you have kids in school? Are you happy with them? Yeah, well, my kid's doing okay, but boy, in Michigan, schools are awful. And I said, what do you mean? well, yeah, don't you, they didn't know I was a reporter. I said, don't you read the headlines? Don't you see how awful we are? Maybe, people who've read the same studies that you all cited of how poorly Michigan is doing. He said, so who do you blame? Well, probably me. That's what I got from one of the clerks. Yeah, I was awful in school. I didn't have a very good experience. So I guess my kids, something rubbed off on them. But don't you go to the school and ask what's going on? No, I don't have time. You have to engage these folks. It's been said before. It's too important. And bottom line, just like those politicians in Washington, it's about self-interest. I can't imagine any parent doing any job of any socioeconomic status saying to you, I don't give a hoot about how my kid does in school. I cannot, and I've never met in my almost 30 years of covering education, a parent who doesn't give a hoot. They do, but they need guidance. They need guidance. Coleman's arguments were compelling, but again, his conclusion to this day has really, really created a dilemma for education reformers. These days, researchers like the economist Richard Rothstein say that if the goal of our education policies is to eliminate all social and class distinctions among children in terms of educational outcomes, Rothstein argues these policies by themselves are going to fail. That means that you have a role to play, whether you have kids in school or not. I've been reporting on education for nearly 30 years, and much of that time in some of the most impoverished communities in this country, and I don't know if schools can compensate for so many things that they have no control over. But there's one thing I do know, that without good, safe schools and well-trained caring teachers, children will remain trapped in our communities, our nation, at risk of losing yet another generation of children to poverty. So, what are we to do? Who's going to lead? I think you must lead. The one final recommendation for a book you should all be reading is Robert Putnam. He's a Harvard social scientist who wrote a book called Our Kids, the American Dream in Crisis. And he says something that I guess I had not thought about, but I kind of understand. He says, there are no villains in all this. He says, our social and educational policies reflect collective decisions. We are all to blame for the dysfunction of our education system and its failure to address especially the plight of poor, undereducated, marginalized children and families that struggle. Putnam's book, of course, is not the first and won't be the last to examine with a high degree of urgency the impact that poverty has on learning, teaching, and reading, and how that contributes to this nation's class and racial divide. For me, though, his book helped crystallize my personal views that it's opportunity, in the end, it's opportunity itself that's at risk. The kind of opportunity that my mother, as an immigrant, the opportunity she sought for her children when we immigrated to this country. It's the kind that we earn by working hard, because that is what America rewards. Hard work. As Putnam argues, most Americans don't begrudge success or wealth and those who've earned it through hard work. They begrudge the lack of opportunity. So we must ask ourselves this. When does a particular effort to promote equal opportunity, quality schools, quality teachers, when does that effort to promote these things entail unacceptable costs? Because the costs that we're already paying are clear. And if we've accepted these costs and this crisis we're in, my God, why doesn't it take that much more effort to benefit from the real investment that this nation needs to look at so that all our children can read and succeed? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think we should open this up for questions, if there are any. I didn't mean to depress you, by the way. So, and those of you who have a question, please just briefly identify yourselves, and then tell us what your question is. I think there's a mic coming around the corner.
My name is Rick Adamy. My question is this.
Maybe you could grab the mic.
My name is Rick Adamy. My question is, how much of this is a lack of money for the public schools? If you had more resources for the public schools, would that make a dent in the problem?
I don't know, and I'll tell you why. I live in a city, Washington, D.C., where the school system spends upwards of $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 per child. And arguably, it has an enormous problem. The achievement gap there is unquestionable. But I'll tell you this too. I've never been to a suburban, wealthy, affluent, like so many around Washington. Montgomery County, Maryland, Fairfax County, Virginia, with some of the most successful, extraordinary schools you'll ever find anywhere. I've never been to a suburban school system where people are giving back money because they're spending too much. Money matters. What you do with it is the issue. What you do with it. You know that when there was a guy named Bill Porter who used to run around on behalf of the White House back during the first Bush years, the late 80s, whose sole job was to go around denouncing, among other things, this question of whether the Fed should be spending more money on education, which isn't a lot, by the way. It's upwards of maybe 8-10% of state budgets. Not a lot compared to other nations. And as far as GDP, maybe 1.5-2%. So this guy used to go around saying, it's not money. Money's not the problem. You can't go around asking, putting out, you know. The problem with that argument is that it creates a false argument in many ways that says that the money you're spending isn't going to matter. It's not a matter of, because I don't think politically anyway these days it's realistic to ask people to pay more money for their kids' education. And if it comes from anywhere, it's going to come out of pocket from parents who have the wealth. It's not going to come from state or federal governments. Forget it. It's not. So it's it's an argument, it's a polemic, but it's not going to happen. So the question then becomes, are you as a citizenry, are you as members of this community, are you as residents of the state of Michigan holding your schools and your state accountable for the way you spend your money? What Porter missed, and he used to say, the United States between 1983, nation at risk, and the late 80s and early to mid 90s, has increased its education budgets by 40, 50, 100%. And he wasn't lying, it's true. But you know where almost all that money was going to? Special education. Funding of $40,000, $50,000 per kid, who the school systems were not able to accommodate. So they had to find private education for them. That huge jump in education funding since 1983 has been almost entirely invested in special education because of a law that says, IDEA, the law that says you can no longer warehouse these kids, you have to educate them. And if it costs you an arm and a leg, so be it. That's your responsibility. Well, you know how much of that tab the federal government picks up? Maybe 30% at most. It's one of those classic unfunded mandates. I don't know if it's a roundabout way of answering your question or whether I even answered it, but money matters. It's how you spend it. And my question to you is, are you holding your schools accountable? Do you go to your local superintendent? 80% of most of that money goes to teacher salaries. Do I get an amen on that? But the question then becomes, are you paying these teachers enough? I'm not an advocate, by the way, of saying we should be paying teachers like we pay doctors. That's unrealistic. But I've been, again, to too many places where teachers are earning, a living wage? Barely. What kind of incentive is that for a bright college student somewhere to say, yes, I'm going to take up teaching, when they know that they'll barely be able to afford housing, a car, getting married? It's an issue that this nation has punted over and over and over again. Money is not the solution. It is one of the solutions. 80% of this, 90% of this issue boils down to holding institutions, lawmakers, teachers, educators accountable. Because by not holding them accountable, you create this environment in which everybody just throws their hands up in the air and say, there's nothing we can do. Or, hey, as long as it doesn't affect my kid, I'm fine with it. Self-interest can be corrosive. More questions?
I have one here. Carol Lautenbach, Godfrey Lee Schools. You mentioned pre-K education and educating parents as promising practices for change. Are there things you've seen in your travels and time reporting on education, some other promising practices that you can share with us?
Small schools, I would start there. The early to mid 60s consolidation, rush to consolidate school systems, I don't know if people would agree with this or not, I think contributed to a slippery slope towards mediocrity. Although it was done for good reasons. I've been to schools where maybe, high school graduating class of 50 kids. I think that's healthy. I think it's the one place in a small environment in which adults connect with kids, and kids aren't numbers. Or they're not that person's problem. They're your problem. And I think that small schools create not just more nurturing environments, but they create a sense of, going back to this notion of accountability. When your teachers know that kid's parents or the environment in which that kid's growing up, and a good teacher takes that an interest in that child, I think kids know that. They don't see themselves as numbers or as kids who are lost in a system that doesn't understand them. The only problem often is that, can a teacher save a child's life? Literally. Because I've met teachers who have. But is that their responsibility? Are they, I guess a harsh way of putting this, are they getting paid to save children from circumstances in their communities or in their families? No. But that's the DNA of teachers. Anyway, the good teachers, and I know many. So the policies that we're talking about, in terms of, for example, how you teach reading, I'll go back to the point I made earlier. The science today that has kicked in to tell us how a kid's brain works is transformative. It wasn't that long ago that the science didn't matter. The science was just way up here, abstract. And I've always complained to researchers, first of all, speak English. Learn how to write things that people can understand rather than be an echo chamber for other researchers. What use is that when people write books that nobody can read? The irony. I think that the science that we are now in looking at the child's brain and and the role of things like trauma, boy, they have the potential to transform, to change. But there's a big if. Only if teachers have access to that research and to the new pedagogy, to the new methodology, to the things that we're discovering about the age at which children and their brains can absorb the kinds of skills that we need them to have. And to get rid of all those myths that exist out there that teachers still buy into because nobody's told them any different. So I guess my answer to you is small is good, and research and science that helps rethink the way we teach, everything from reading to history, that's good too. And some people are doing it better than others. You know, if you look at Connecticut, Massachusetts, they're not doing terribly well, but compared to other countries, if they were countries themselves, they'd be right up there with Finland, Singapore, South Korea, and all these, marginally good studies that are done across the world. There are states in this country that have done and are doing something well. I've never understood why, if Michigan, for example, is looking in the mirror and saying, boy, we're almost last. Why not just go figure out how Connecticut did it, or has done it, or Massachusetts for that matter. Now, I understand the whole provincial view that, well, Michigan is Michigan. I mean, we can't go around, comparing ourselves to anybody else. Education is local. But man, these days, I think there's too much evidence out there that shows that somebody's figured something out. And I think it's the responsibility of a citizenry or certainly people like you engaged in this, to say, we should take a look at that. Let's look at the research. Let's see what they have found that, for whatever reason, we have not, or we are not benefiting from. Oh, we have to move on. I'm going to be here through the panel discussion. So, and you're all welcome to approach me and tell me I was all wrong. Or if you have any story ideas, let me know. Thank you.
Thank you.